the committee is commencing its study of allegations of political interference in the 2020 Nova Scotia mass murder investigation. With us today on the first panel, the Honourable Bill Blair, PCMP, Minister of Emergency Preparedness, and Mr. Rob Stewart, Deputy Minister, Department of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness.
On April 18th and 19th in 2020, an unthinkable tragedy unfolded in Nova Scotia. All Canadians were shaken by these horrific deaths and mourned alongside the affected communities. I would like to take this opportunity to reiterate my support and condolences for the families, for those who lost their lives in these violent attacks, and our commitment to ensure that they get the answers that they need. We are all looking forward to the inquiry's fact-based findings, which I understand are due to be released later this year. And as the Commission conducts its work, I remain committed to the fundamental principle of operational independence for law enforcement in this country. And I want to make very clear, at no point did I direct the RCMP in any operational matter, including on public communications. I did not ask them to release any specific information, nor did I receive a promise for them to do so. And as you will find in all of my public statements from that time, I confirmed that identifying the weapons used was a decision wholly within the purview of the RCMP. It's during the years in which I had the honour of serving as Minister of Border and Organised Crime and then as Minister of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness, one of my top priorities was addressing gun violence in Canada. This was a key item in my mandate letter, which directed me to keep our communities safe by implementing new gun control measures, including a ban on assault-style firearms. Work on this issue had been underway for quite some time, and just within these few years, we have seen far too many examples of the kind of harm that these firearms can cause. At the shooting at the Quebec City Mosque, another gunman killed 2 police officers in Fredericton and 2 civilians. And in our neighbour to the south, the AR-15 alone has been used in the mass shootings at the Pulse nightclub, in Sutherland Springs, at Stoneman Douglas High School, and perhaps most tragically, at the Sandy Hook Elementary School. The tragedy that occurred in Nova Scotia only deepened our resolve to move forward with this critically important work. And that is why, Mr. Chair, on May 1st, 2020, we announced the OIC prohibiting over 1,500 models of assault-style firearms and their variants. Combating gun violence is a complex and continual process. An issue requires a multifaceted approach, and we will continue to keep Canadians safe by implementing stronger gun controls. Mr. Speaker, I would conclude, if I may, by reiterating that at no time have I ever interfered operationally or given operational direction to the RCMP in my role as the Minister of Public Safety. I thank you all. I look forward to the questions that you may have.
Thank you, Minister, for being with us today. You or someone from your office was in daily contact with Commissioner Lucki in the immediate days following the Nova Scotia attacks on April 18th and 19th, correct?
I was not in contact with her on a daily basis, but frequently in the days afterwards, I was briefed by Commissioner Lucki.
As well as your Chief of Staff and your Deputy Minister were in relatively daily contact with Commissioner Lucki in some capacity?
Yes, I assume so.
So would you be comfortable tabling for the committee before our next meeting your calendar, your Deputy Minister's calendar, and your Chief of Staff's calendar and phone logs relevant to your communication with Commissioner Lucki prior to our next committee meeting, specifically from the dates of April 18th to April 28th, and including April 28th, and that would be for the reason of full transparency of your communications and your office's communications with her?
I actually have a timeline with me, and I'm quite comfortable sharing that. And when I personally had conversations, there's a number of different things in that timeline.
Minister, does that include the communication from your Deputy Minister and from your Chief of Staff with Commissioner Lucki as well?
And again, I'm more than happy to provide you with a timeline of all my communications on this matter with Commissioner Lucki and with others.
Including the Deputy Minister's communications and the Chief of Staff, 𝐐EH𝐻𝐻𝐻's communications?
I don't know if if the Deputy Minister has that information available, so I don't want to make a commitment to it, but that's a question certainly you can pose to him.
Certainly, there would be phone logs of all the calls that they have made. Can you commit to tabling those for the committee before our next meeting of yourself, the Deputy Minister, and the Chief of Staff, 𝐐EH𝐻𝐻𝐻, before our next committee meeting?
And again, I don't have direct access to those logs, but if they exist, I think it's very important.
You commit to it?
If I may, I think it's very important that this committee have all the information that it requires to make an accurate assessment of what transpired.
In a June 28th, 2020 Globe and Mail article, you were quoted confirming that you did speak to the RCMP about the upcoming OIC ban. When was Commissioner Lucki informed of the May 1st announcement date?
Commissioner Lucki had been working with us, but Commissioner Lucki, as the Commissioner of the RCMP, is responsible for the Canadian Firearms Program. The Canadian Firearms Program, as it was integral in the work
Minister Blair,
that we...
when was she informed of the May 1st date of that announcement?
And I don't, that's a question that would have to be
When was the
posed
May
to...
1st date determined for that announcement? Was it before or after the Nova Scotia attacks?
The date of release was determined after the Nova Scotia shooting.
Thank you. You're aware of the email sent by Commissioner Lucki on April 23rd, 4 days after the attacks to your Chief of Staff, Zita Astravez, containing information your government had requested concerning weapons used in the attacks, correct?
Yes, I'm aware of it.
And you're also aware that the Commissioner's email contained a strong warning that the information must not be shared beyond you and the Prime Minister because it could jeopardize the active investigation, correct?
I'm not only aware of it, but I respected that throughout.
And you're aware of the meeting the Commissioner called for her and her Nova Scotia officials immediately following the Nova Scotia press conference on April 28th?
I was not aware of that. I've subsequently become aware of it through media reports.
You're aware that during that meeting, the Commissioner reprimanded her Nova Scotia deputies for not sharing the information she warned you not to share, correct?
I'm not aware of that. I was not a party to that conversation, and I've only read media reports. I've not discussed that in any way with the Commissioner.
Your office obtained assurances from Commissioner Lucki that the type of weapons used in the shooting would be released to the public at the April 28th press conference, correct?
No, that's incorrect.
So it was not assured. You had no idea that that was Commissioner Lucki's expectation in that press conference?
Let me be very clear. At no time did I ask Commissioner Lucki to reveal that information. At no time did I direct her in any way in her communications. She did not make any promise to me.
A bit. I'm not asking if you had asked her, but I'm asking if you were aware of the Commissioner's expectation that on that April 28th press conference that information would be released. Were you aware that that was Commissioner Lucki's expectation?
No, I was not.
You were not aware. In a late-night email sent from Commissioner Lucki to your Chief of Staff and your Deputy Minister on April 28th following the meeting and the press conference, her email to your Deputy and the Chief of Staff said, without any context whatsoever, that the press conference was, quote, to quote Commissioner Lucki, not the expectation execution she was expecting. Again, she said in her email without further context that the press conference was, quote, not the execution she was expecting. So that's in reference to the immediate questions on the types of weapons used. The lack of context provided in Commissioner Lucki's
I can't
email.
comment on the context of that. I wasn't aware of it, and I have no knowledge of what Commissioner was referring to.
It seems that your Deputy Minister and your Chief of Staff were fully aware of the expectation of Commissioner Lucki of that press conference. To the Deputy Minister, were you aware of the context of this email? Because it was not listed in the email, and it was written that you would have been aware.
I have no idea what...
To the Deputy Minister, please. Thank you. Were you aware of the context of the email?
Not in the sense that you are posing the question. I was aware that the Commissioner expected there to be full disclosure of what the RCMP knew for the sake of the public.
Yeah, that's what I'm asking. So you were aware of the context of the email being that the Commissioner's expectation of the April 28th press conference was that information on the weapons would be released. So thank you for confirming that you were aware of the context.
Ms. Dancho, if I may, that's simply not correct. I don't believe there's anything in that email that makes reference to any information about firearms.
I will just read it again. So there is no context in this email, but Commissioner Lucki said in reference to the press conference that it was not the execution she was expecting. She then went on to provide comment from media and Darren Campbell of when he was asked about the weapons used. So I appreciate that you were aware of the context of that email, even though it was not listed, which would mean that you were aware of it earlier in the day.
I'd like to just make sure you're clear
please
on
go
my
ahead.
point here.
You've got 10 seconds. You've got 10 seconds to be clear.
To the best of my recollection, the Commissioner had provided some assurance that the RCMP would provide the public with a full story of what had happened and what they knew. That was what I understood.
Thank you. Thank you. The time is up.
And describe the nature of the relationship between the Minister of Public Safety and the Commissioner of the RCMP, and how that relationship actually works operationally, is supposed to work, and how it worked in this particular situation.
But in that reporting relationship, I think there's a very clear and important line of delineation in that the Minister, under no circumstances, can offer or direct in any way operational activities of the RCMP, not to tell them, for example, who to investigate, what charges should be laid, or in any aspect of their operational duties. And so the RCMP have a responsibility to be accountable to the people of Canada through the Government of Canada. And I as the Minister of Public Safety, I'm regularly and routine briefed by the RCMP Commissioner on matters of significant national concern, but at no time am I able, nor would I ever, give her any operational direction on any investigative matter, and that includes information that would be communicated with the public. Those are decisions made independently, quite appropriately, independently by the police of jurisdiction, in this case the RCMP, and not something that I would ever interfere with.
In this situation and during this awful tragedy, was there a time when the minister or when the commissioner of the RCMP sought your direction?
No, the commissioner did not, and has never, in my experience and the over 2 years I worked with her as the public safety minister, sought my direction on any operational matter. In the aftermath of this tragic event, the commissioner was providing the government of Canada, through me, very comprehensive briefings on what had transpired, providing us with information about the sequence of events, the number of casualties, and some of the challenges that they were facing. But at the same time, she was very clear on what information was classified and not to be released, and I respected that at all times. And I think you'll see that there were a number of times I spoke publicly and was asked very explicit questions about the investigation and about certain aspects of the communication, and I was clear in every one of those communications that was an operational matter for the RCMP and that I would not in any way interfere with.
I'd like to offer my condolences to the loved ones of the victims. Even though the massacre took place in 2020, I know that this is reopening barely healed wounds. To hear about the inquiry and everything that's appearing in the media on a daily basis, I'm thinking of those people, and I think that it's very important that we be transparent as a form of respect for them in order to respond to their questions as well as possible. And when there are allegations of political interference, that's very serious. I think these people deserve answers. According to the report, Brenda Lucki, the RCMP commissioner, said at a meeting in April 2020, according to Darren Campbell, that she promised you, the minister, that she would make public information about the weapons used during the massacre, even if it compromised the inquiry, as Mr. Campbell stated, because she knew that an order was going to be issued 2 days later and that revealing the weapons used would help your government. Did you actually have those conversations with Ms. Lucki, asking her to reveal the weapons used?
Thank you for the question, and no, I did not. I did not ask her to release that information. It wasn't required. The list of weapons that were being prohibited by the order in council that we brought forward on May 1st had taken months to prepare, and I did not ask the commissioner to release that information, nor did she promise me that she would.
That's an answer we've already had from you in the House of Commons, in the media, but what bothers me about it is that the opposite version, the RCMP version, from what we've seen in an email sent by Ms. Lucki in Mr. Campbell's testimony, is that that's not the case. How do you explain the fact that there are competing versions of facts here? What discussions were had about the order?
There's only one set of facts. I did not ask the commissioner to reveal that information. She did not promise me that she would. You're also referring to a conversation that the commissioner had with her subordinates in Nova Scotia, and there's some information that's come forward with that. I was not a party to that discussion. And I have no knowledge of that discussion. Those are questions about that discussion better put to the participants. But I can say unequivocally and with absolute certainty, I did not direct the RCMP commissioner to reveal that information, nor did she promise me that she would do so.
Earlier, answering the question that my colleague posed, you said that the date when the regulation was unveiled on May 1st, 2020, was chosen after the Portapique massacre. Did that have an influence on the decisions made and on what ended up being in the announcement on May 1st? It kind of seemed like it was dashed off on a napkin with weapons that were used in situations of mass murder, whereas there are other weapons that are not on the list. So what discussions were had after the Portapique massacre regarding what should be in the order that was made on May 1st, 2020? Did the massacre have an influence on your decisions and your political action?
Thank you very much. I think it's important to remind us all that this is a commitment that we had made. Frankly, for me, the banning of and the prohibition of assault-style weapons is something that I have worked on for many years. But we actually campaigned on it in the 2019 election, you may recall. The compiling of the list, and it's a very interesting characterization that you suggest it was done on the back of a napkin. It was several months of very hard work in compiling that list and over 1,500 of those weapons. And there was a very clear criteria that was established in which weapons would make that list, and that list was compiled over many months. And all of the work that we had been doing for months and years leading up to that moment, it certainly had the effect of deepening my resolve to move forward as quickly as possible. We were not alone in this. And for
10
example,
seconds, please.
the leader of the NDP had on April 20th urged us to take some action in response to this terrible tragedy. And that action was well entrained, and we were working very hard on getting it forward. But certainly the terrible events of that event were highly motivating for me to get the job done and to keep
Thank you,
that promise.
Minister.
Do you believe that handwritten notes, especially as they're written, if they're written during the course of a certain action, do you believe that you can put a lot of stock in them? Do you use them personally?
But I have previously, as a police officer, for example, maintained a memo book, which is an aide-de-memoire, and if it's done contemporaneous to events, it can provide good evidence.
I guess the reason why we're here today is it comes to light from the handwritten notes of Superintendent Darren Campbell, and those handwritten notes do make specific reference to the commissioner having said that she had made a promise and that this was tied to impending gun control legislation. Now, you've very clearly stated on the record that no such promise was made, no direction was given. Why then do you think, in your opinion, that Superintendent Campbell would have written that specifically in his notes, which were written during or shortly after a conference call with the commissioner?
I think that's a question better put to the participants in that conversation. I was not a party to it. I had no knowledge of that conversation. I can tell you, and I'll repeat very clearly, I hope for all of you that at no time did I give that operational direction to the RCMP commissioner to release that information, nor did she promise me that she would. But with respect to the conversation she had with her team in Nova Scotia, that's a question that I was not a party to those conversations, a question best put to those who were a party to it.
The Prime Minister has publicly stated that, his government did not put any undue influence or pressure on the RCMP. But that is kind of an evasive answer to a question because, well, he makes specific reference to undue influence or pressure. It may leave open to other types of influence and pressure. How would you interpret the Prime Minister's answer to those specific questions?
Well, with respect, I'm not really feeling that appropriate for me to start interpreting, but let me explain the conversations that were taking place in the immediate aftermath of this terrible tragedy. We were hearing from people right across the country. Most importantly, we were hearing from the families of the victims that there was a great deal of concern and questions about what had taken place. We talked about the need to deal with the absence of red flags prior to the event, police actions taking into account the COVID environment, communications with the public during and after the event, policies with respect to the disposal of RCMP kit and vehicles, training and RCMP preparedness for active shooter complaints, and very importantly, support for the families of the victims.
Thank you, Minister. Yeah. Now, Mr. Noormohamed asked you to carefully explain the relationship between the Minister of Public Safety and the RCMP. You gave a very clear answer. The problem is, Minister, that other governments, previous governments, both conservative and liberal, have had ministers which have given operational direction to the RCMP. We've seen it with the Chrétien government back in the 1990s with the APEC summit. It was given back in the 1950s from the Diefenbaker government with an incident in Newfoundland. So I think the problem, Minister, lies with the interpretation of the RCMP Act, specifically Section 5 Sub 1, which provides basically for the appointment of the commissioner who, under the direction of the minister, has control and management of the force. So my question to you, Minister, that I'm paraphrasing that, but it basically leaves it's quite vague. Would you agree that's quite a vague statement in the act that governs the RCMP?
Can I'll explain that I think it's crystal clear. And the Minister of Public Safety has the ability.
Despite the fact that other governments, though, have overstepped their bounds.
I can just tell you, for me, when I was Minister of Public Safety, it was a very, very bright line. The Minister of Public Safety has the ability to issue ministerial directives with respect to certain policy matters for the RCMP, but that the line between, having government or a politician direct the investigation or any of the operational activities of the RCMP, for me, that's a bright line and one I have never crossed.
I don't doubt that you find it crystal clear, but I'm trying to find ways where we don't get into this kind of situation again in the future. So, Minister, my question to you is, how can we possibly amend this section of the Act to make it crystal clear for predecessors in other governments so that we don't have future meetings where we're questioning the Minister of Public Safety for alleged interference in ongoing RCMP investigations? Are there amendments that you think could be used to strengthen this act so that it is actually crystal clear for everyone who holds that office?
Well, and Mr. MacGregor, I would just point out to you that in my experience as the public safety minister, there were a number of instances where actually some of my colleagues in the House were insisting that the police be directed in their activities in response to blockades and investigations and other matters. And at all times, I have maintained the principle that we will never interfere with the operations of the RCMP.
Mr. Chair, it's a great pleasure to be here representing the great people of Cumberland, Colchester, of course, where this unfortunate incident took place for the most part. Thank you, Minister, for being here. Just to quote, Nova Scotians told us they needed this process to be independent, thorough, and transparent, and we agree. Minister Blair, do you know who said that, sir?
I suspect it was me.
It was you. That's very correct, sir.
And by the way, I believe that.
Great. Oddly enough, though, sir, from the very beginning, you did not want an inquiry. Is that true?
No, let me be very clear. I think thank you for the opportunity to clarify that concern.
I don't really need any clarification, sir. I just need a simple yes or no.
Well, in fact, in the immediate days following the shooting, I reached out to the province of Nova Scotia, and I had proposed terms of reference to conduct a broad review of the mass shooting in Nova Scotia.
Sir, we understand that. Thank you. Sir, I know that we're tight on time, so let's get to the matter. You wanted a review, not an inquiry, and then when the inquiry came around, you took the opportunity, sir, to actually appoint some very interesting commissioners, oddly enough. Mr. MacDonald, first cousin to one of the individuals who was shot, well-known Liberal, stayed charges against Jerry Riggin. Ms. Fitch, father was a Mountie, 5-year chief of police, on a board of the RCMP, and Ms. Stanton, who actually wrote a book in 2021, released before the commission started, to change the way public inquiries are held. Is that not political interference from the very beginning, sir?
Absolutely not, sir. And in fact, I spoke to the Attorney General in Nova Scotia. He'd recommended former Chief Justice, Justice MacDonald, as the Commission Chair. Chief Fitch had been the chief in Fredericton when two of her officers and 2 citizens were killed in another mass shootings in that location.
Those facts are well known. I really appreciate that.
Point of order, Chair. Can we allow the minister to answer the question asked of him?
Yes, I think we have to have a little smoother flow here. Minister, you've got the floor.
Yeah, thank you. And we worked very carefully to ensure that when we established initially what was to be a review, but we heard very clearly from the families. They were very concerned about the ability of the Commission of Inquiry to subpoena witnesses. And so in response to that, we did declare a public inquiry to give them those tools. And I happily provide the committee with the proposed terms of reference, which was developed on April 27, 2020. That's only a week after this terrible tragic event, recognizing that the people of Nova Scotia, the people of your community, needed answers, and we wanted to make sure they got those answers.
Well, thank you, sir. It's obviously that we see the choices made politically somewhat different, and I would suggest to you, sir, that the members of the families who are affected, the grieving families of people like Lisa McCulley and Greg and Jamie Blair and Kristen Beaton and Heather O'Brien, that those families see this very, very differently from what you do, sir. One of the other things I think that's important is quite clearly with the back and forth we've had now with our NDP member, our bloc member, our team here as well, sir, that someone's not telling the truth here. That's the unusual thing. There's a conflicting level of evidence that my bloc colleague clearly pointed out, that there's a contrary nature to what was said through the notes of Minister Campbell, who you said is also an exemplary officer. Who from the PMO were your staff communicating with in the days following the attacks?
Sorry?
Who from the PMO was your staff or yourself communicating with during the days after the attack?
I don't know. I can tell you that there were regular briefings taking place between the RCMP, and I was also briefing my cabinet colleagues on the event.
And did you speak directly to the Prime Minister, sir?
And again, I was briefing the entire cabinet on.
Did you speak directly to the Prime Minister, sir? I think it's a pretty simple question.
And I've just said I was speaking to the entire cabinet on that matter.
Did you speak directly to the Prime Minister, sir? Please answer. Simple, yes or no.
The Prime Minister is present in the cabinet. He's the head of our government.
Did you have a direct conversation with him, sir?
Not a separate conversation on these events. It was in the context of a cabinet discussion.
Very good, sir. Mr. Stewart, do you remember any meetings with the Prime Minister that yourself, Chief of Staff, or the Minister may have had?
I did not attend any meetings with the Prime Minister, and I am not sure. I would have to check my schedule, and as Ms. Dancho has asked, we will give you the schedules.
And sir, through all this, obviously that you were present in multiple briefings during all this. You know, someone's not telling the truth again, sir. Do you have an opinion on that?
You're asking me?
Yes, sir.
10 seconds, please.
I don't believe that to be the case. I think this answer will take more than 10 seconds, sorry. There was a great deal of desire to have the RCMP tell the public what happened, because in the days following the crisis, or the event, the tragic event, the story was very unclear. So there was a great deal of desire for that to be the case. And that, in the Commissioner's mind, I believe, included the guns.
You had a mandate letter, December 13th, 2019, directing you to implement the government's firearms policy. First on the list was to deal with military-style assault weapons. Is this item in your mandate, does it reflect the will of Canadians?
I believe that there is overwhelming support for the prohibition of assault-style weapons. I also understand, because I've heard very clearly from those in representing the gun industry, for example, who've been strongly opposed to it.
Would releasing the specific details of the weapons used in the Nova Scotia shootings, would the release of that information been necessary to justify the ban to Canadians?
I don't think it's in any way relevant, to be frank. There are many documented instances where these style of weapons have been used in mass shootings in Canada and around the world. And I personally believe that there is no place in a civil and safe society for such weapons. That they were designed for military use and not for recreational use, and there have just been far too many tragedies where they have been used. I did not, and I still do not have all the particulars on what weapons were used and in what circumstances in the Nova Scotia shooting, but I also believe that mass shooting was another symptom.
Now, 5 days after the shooting, Superintendent Campbell disclosed into a news conference that the gunman had 2 semi-automatic handguns and 2 semi-automatic rifles, although the government had received a briefing document dated that same day that provided many more details. In your opinion, for purposes of informing the public, Superintendent Campbell's disclosure, was it sufficient to give the media and Canadians the essential information about the weapons used?
Yes, and in fact, it was more than sufficient, and I certainly didn't require or seek to have more released. I was aware by that time and when we brought forward the order in council what weapons are used, but the RCMP had been very clear, as had Superintendent Campbell. Can I also comment that I watched the press conference with Superintendent Campbell on April 24th, and quite frankly, I thought in that press conference his delivery and the information he shared was outstanding. I was particularly respectful of the fact that he stood and answered every question that was put to him. I also heard later that morning from the Attorney General in Nova Scotia, who was equally relieved by the information that the superintendent shared on April 24th.
Were you privy to any details or preparation for the superintendent's 24th or April 28th media briefings?
No, I was not. I was receiving information from the RCMP commissioner, information on what was transpired, but I was not involved in any of the briefings with the Nova Scotia officers or detachment in their response, and had no information on what was being told to them or what they were going to say.
After the shootings in Christchurch, New Zealand, the Prime Minister of New Zealand acted very, very quickly to institute a ban. The incident in Nova Scotia accelerated the release of the OIC and the ban. What response did you get from the Canadian public when that announcement was made on May 1st.
It was overwhelmingly
Mr.
positive.
Hardie, you're out of time, but I want to give the minister 15 seconds to answer that question.
Very, very strong response from the medical community, from police chiefs associations across the country, from the Canadian Police Association, which is the police union. There was strong support for the OIC that was brought forward prohibiting those assault weapons.
Minister, the Director of Strategic Communications in Halifax stated that government representatives, when you were Minister of Public Safety, stated that they were evaluating what they could and could not say. We're talking about a massacre, a tragedy, where police officers are the people best positioned to determine what to say rather than political officials. You spoke about independence for national police and transparency. And so this idea that you and Prime Minister Trudeau wanted to control the message, that the government wanted to control the message about what could and couldn't be said, it gives the sense that instead of thinking about the victims, that you were thinking about your political agenda. That's the message it sends. Are you aware that that is the message that is being seen by the public?
First of all, I've never ever met or had a conversation with that individual. At no time have I ever given her, nor did my government give her, any direction on what she could or could not say. So I have no basis, I have no understanding or no facts upon which to make a determination why that would be said, because it's simply not true. And as well, I think it's important to understand the context that the Deputy Minister referred to. There was in the immediate days following this shooting a tremendous amount of public concern about what had taken place and a great need from the families, from the community, by Nova Scotians and people right across Canada to understand what had happened and why it had happened. And that it was very important that information that could be shared with the public, expressing very real concern that the RCMP was not being forthcoming with information and urging us to make that information public. And in response to those questions in the House, I answered that it is the decision of the RCMP, that only the RCMP could determine what information would be released. But I understood, as I understood now, their very sincere concern that more information needed to be shared.
Minister, my questions are going to be for the Deputy Minister. In response to earlier questions from my colleague regarding the April 28th email from Brenda Lucki Commissioner Lucki to yourself and to the Chief of Staff to the Public Safety Minister, you said that in response to her line that this was not the execution that she was expecting. You understood that to mean that she was expecting the nature of the firearms to be disclosed at the meeting earlier that day, the press conference. Is that correct?
No.
Can you please clarify what you said earlier to my colleague then?
I said my understanding and recollection is that the Commissioner, following the event and including the press conference of April 24th and the press conference of April 28th, was making a promise in a general sense to the minister that that information would be disclosed, the full amount of information that she thought appropriate.
So you believe that she believed she was making a promise to the minister to disclose this information?
I think she had a conversation, not with me in the room, but I talked to her periodically, and I think she was making a commitment that as the investigation proceeded, they would.
This was a meeting with the commissioner and the minister, but you were not in the room.
Correct.
But the minister was in the room.
Well, to be honest, I don't know when the commissioner and the minister talk.
But you were aware of a meeting that took place, and the minister would have been in that meeting.
I believe there were a number of conversations, as the minister has said.
But you were not involved in these conversations.
In the aftermath of that event, there was, I don't recall, and the schedules will obviously tell you the truth here.
I just find it very interesting that the deputy minister in a case like this you were not involved in all conversations taking place between the commissioner and the minister on this matter. So I find that very interesting.
These officials, the heads of these organizations, including Brenda Lucki and the heads of CSIS and CBSA, are independently accountable to the minister. I'm not in every conversation.
I understand. But when she sent that email, and you had said earlier in the meeting that you were aware that it was regarding the guns, regarding information about the guns. That was the execution she was talking about.
No, I don't. Actually,
so you had no idea what the email was about? I
think the commitment was that the investigation would be, or the situation and what was happening with the investigation would be fulsome and forthcoming.
So when you get an email like that and you don't really understand exactly what she's talking about, did you send a follow-up email asking, what are you talking about, Commissioner? What execution are you referencing?
No.
You didn't send any follow-up email?
No.
Are you aware of any meetings with the ministers chief of staff with the commissioner of the RCMP prior to the press conference discussing whether or not information about the firearms would be disclosed?
No, I'm not aware.
You weren't in any of those meetings?
No.
Okay. And so the RCMP commissioner, and you would agree, the RCMP commissioner had an expectation, you had said earlier, that the firearms would be disclosed at the press conference.
I think you keep saying it that way, and that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is there was an expectation on her part that there would be a full disclosure, and in her mind, it would be the guns included. That's what that email reveals. I don't believe it's a result, and I agree with the minister. I never was witness to any commitment or promise made that there would be information provided about the guns.
But you said earlier that you believed that the commissioner believed that she was making a promise.
To be fulsome about the investigation. What that meant is a question you will have to ask her.
Yes, and that's something that we'll definitely be asking. Were you aware of the April 23rd email from the commissioner to the chief of staff to the minister saying that the information about the firearms used should not be disseminated beyond the Prime Minister's office and the minister's office?
Yes, I was.
Were you aware of any reason why that directive would have changed in the 5 days following? Was there any discussion about why the minister believed that that should be the case and why that might have changed?
Not to my knowledge.
So the commissioner appears to have made a complete 180 on what she said on April 23rd, that the information should not be disseminated. And then 5 days later, based on the witness testimony of Leah Scanlon and Superintendent Campbell, that she was quite upset that the information was not revealed, and you were not aware of any conversations that took place in those 5 days with either yourself or the minister's office regarding why that decision would be made to reverse that decision.
Correct.
Okay. Mr. Chair, I'll cede the rest of my time.
Let me begin, and let me be clear. I did not interfere in the investigation around this tragedy. Specifically, I was not directed to publicly release information about weapons used by the perpetrator to help advance pending gun control legislation. Was there pressure for information from the federal government about this incident? Yes. This wasn't surprising as we were dealing with the biggest mass shooting incident in our country, and it was my responsibility to keep relevant officials apprised of the evolving situation while maintaining the integrity of the operation. Were the requests for information and updates political interference? No. And in my dealings with Minister Blair, he was very conscious of this and has never sought to interfere in this investigation. RCMP employees may have different perspectives based on the meeting of April 28th. However, I was the only RCMP official dealing with the minister, other senior government officials, and occasionally with the Prime Minister. And I'm the only one who can speak to the nature of these requests, exchanges of information, and my intentions during that meeting. The integrity of police investigation is critical. As somebody with over 35 years of policing, that's something I would never seek to influence or jeopardize, nor would I allow RCMP investigations to be dictated or influenced by government officials. I am accountable to the minister from an administrative perspective, but the RCMP is operationally independent. The basis for this principle is to prevent direct and specific political control of police operational activity, with the sole responsibility for operational decision-making resting in the hands of police officers. Keeping the government informed through timely and accurate information sharing is not interference. It's standard procedure, and these situational updates are provided without compromising the operational integrity of an investigation. I did provide information on April 23rd about the types of weapons found in the perpetrator's possession, information that was to be shared with the minister and the Prime Minister, noting that it wasn't to be disseminated any further as there was an active investigation. Additional information was shared as well, but government officials were advised that any information received couldn't be shared with the media until first released by the RCMP. This included such information as the number and names of the deceased, replica police uniforms and vehicle information, the incident at the fire hall, the background of the perpetrator, and the weapons used and seized. In the lead up to the Nova Scotia press conference scheduled for April 28th, I provided information to the government on what would be released. At that time, I was asked if the information about the weapons would be included. When my communications team told me that it would be, I relayed this information back to the Minister Blair's Chief of Staff and the Deputy Minister of Public Safety. Regarding my use of the word promise during the meeting I had with my team following that press conference, at that time and in that context, I was trying to convey that I had already confirmed to the Minister that the information about the weapons would be released during the press conference, a confirmation made based on the information I had been provided. Due to a miscommunication, this was not the case, and I felt I had misinformed the Minister and by extension the Prime Minister. These were difficult, dynamic, and demanding circumstances, and everybody was doing their best to provide as much information to the government, to the public, to the media about this appalling event. This all took place just over a month after COVID-19 was declared a global pandemic. The pandemic fundamentally changed how we managed this incident. The unfortunate reality is that the information flow from Nova Scotia colleagues into my office in the hours and days following the shooting wasn't what it should have been. It was for this reason I called the meeting, to express my disappointment and frustration and to outline expectations. Once I was informed during that meeting of the miscommunication and that releasing the information would jeopardize the ongoing investigation, I considered the matter closed and did not pursue it further. This was clearly articulated back to the Minister, and in fact, to support my assertion on non-interference, this information was not released until several months later. On the matter of the April 28th meeting itself, it needed to happen. It was essential that I had more time and more timely and accurate information, and it was important that my team understood my expectations going forward. It wasn't helped by the fact that it was a teleconference. I had no visual cues for how my words affected those on the call. In the early days of the pandemic, we didn't have access to the on-screen platforms we do now. But the timing of the meeting itself was not ideal, and I should have been more sensitive to those in attendance. People who had been operating in a high-stress and a very emotionally charged environment and had just completed a significant press conference. Given this context, I regret the timing and how I framed the conversation, but the discussion was still necessary. It wasn't brought to my attention until a year later that there were concerns of political interference stemming from that meeting and that my approach and interactions with my team were in question. Had I known my words and approach had such an effect, I would have definitely made things right sooner. This is who I am. Let me be clear. I did not interfere in the investigation. I did not receive direction, and I was not influenced by government officials regarding the public release of information and, more importantly, on the direction of the investigation. I ensured operational independence was maintained in all my interactions with government, as I do today. In closing, I will note that the RCMP is committed to supporting the important work of the Mass Casualty Commission. Anytime we have a mechanism to review and improve how we operate is critical. Thank you. Merci beaucoup.
I appreciate the opportunity to appear before you today. As stated, my name is Brian Brennan, and I am the Deputy Commissioner of Contract and Indigenous Policing. In this capacity, I am responsible for the RCMP's Contract and Indigenous Policing program, which includes overseeing delivery of local policing services in Canada's 3 territories and in all provinces except for Ontario and Quebec. I am posted here in Ottawa. For context, prior to starting this position as Deputy Commissioner, I was the commanding officer in Nova Scotia, which we refer to as H Division. As Deputy Commissioner, it is my responsibility to keep abreast of, and when appropriate, provide guidance related to serious or significant situations occurring on the ground across our divisions, to ensure a uniform level of service and consistent responses to operational issues that arise as a result of our frontline policing responsibilities. Across the RCMP, 6 divisional commanding officers are direct reports to me, including the 4 commanding officers in the Atlantic provinces. In the context of the mass casualty event in 2020, this meant I was supporting H Division by working with national headquarters business lines to ensure operational requests in support of the division were actioned and providing briefing updates to senior executive committee and other commanding officers. I was in regular contact with the Commissioner, the commanding officer of Nova Scotia, and her team to gather information and support their response, including efforts to provide support and resources to the division from other parts of the RCMP across the country. My focus was on policing operations rather than public communications. Understandably, there were many questions about what was happening on the ground and what information was available to share from the division. The Commissioner required timely and regular updates on the evolving situation to support her work and exercise her responsibilities as Commissioner. This was appropriate and expected. And with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have on this matter. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the Commissioner and Deputy Commissioner for being here today. Commissioner Lucki, in an April 28th email from you, you said that you provided to government information that would be released to the public, correct?
On what day?
April 28th. There was several emails from you, I think 2 in particular.
Yeah, there were several versions of speaking notes that were being used by the people on the ground in Nova Scotia. That was one of many versions.
Okay, so in one email from you on April 28th, in one of the emails you confirmed the information about the weapons would be released in the press conference, correct?
Yes.
So that would have been early morning of April 28th?
I believe so.
Okay, thank you. The Deputy Minister, Stewart, who just came before you in committee, informed the committee earlier of a conversation which this promise that you mentioned in your opening remarks happened. It was during a discussion with the Minister. The Deputy Minister was not there, but he was aware of this discussion. You mentioned this in your opening remarks, correct?
Yeah, it wasn't a promise, it was a confirmation, because I was asked if that information would be included in the media release. I verified through my comms people who verified with the people on the ground, and at that point they had advised that it was in fact going to be part of that big media event on April 28th.
Just to be clear, the Minister asked you if the weapons used in the attack would be mentioned in the press release or in the press conference.
He was speaking of the weapons in the incident, so that would mostly include the weapons seized, because the weapons used were still under forensics. So it was more involved with the weapons seized.
Just to confirm, the Deputy Minister, or the Minister of Public Safety at the time, Bill Blair, specifically asked you if weapons used during the attack would be mentioned in the press conference of April 28th.
Yeah, I would, in the sense that it was any of the weapons involved in the incident. So some were seized and not used, and some were used.
And you made a promise to him that that information would be released on the April 28th press conference, correct?
I confirmed, in fact, that they were going to be part of the media event.
So Darren Campbell's account of the meeting that happened, that you had called following that press conference, again, that meeting happened immediately or within 2 hours after, where he wrote in his notes that you had made a promise to Minister Blair that that information about the weapons would be released. He was accurate in this, given what you're saying.
That's what he wrote, but like I said in my notes, in the context, the word promise that I used was in the context of confirming the answer to his question.
But you used the word promise, correct?
I don't recollect that. I may have. I'm not going to question Superintendent Campbell's recollection, but
So
it was in the context of confirming the information that was asked of me.
You said to the RCMP officials in that infamous April 28th meeting that you promised Minister Blair that the information about the weapons would be released, just in sum, correct?
I was referring to the confirmation of the question.
Mr. Campbell also mentioned in his notes, as you're aware, that you tied that to the forthcoming gun policy, correct?
It was when we were speaking of many different flow of information through the last 10 days. There was a lot of issues with the flow of information. The weapons was just but one part of my frustration with and why the meeting was
Commissioner
called.
Lucki, did you, as according to Darren Campbell's notes and the letter to you from Ms. Gallen from a year later, both of them said in their remarks that you tied that promise to the forthcoming Liberal gun policy? OIC, pardon me. Is that correct?
What I did recall mentioning was that the reason why the weapons were so important and why they asked if they were going to be included was tied to the minister's mandate letter.
So you did connect the two?
Yes,
correct?
I did.
Okay. Ms. Scallon also mentioned that you said in the meeting that there was pressure from Minister Blair on you. Is that correct?
No, I don't recall saying that.
So she is incorrect in what she wrote to you?
I cannot tell you if she's incorrect or not. That's her recollection.
So you did not feel pressure in that meeting when you spoke to Minister Blair and you promised him that you get that information released about the weapons
First of all,
used?
I didn't promise him. I confirmed the answer to his question. And second of all, in regards to your second part of the question, there was a lot of pressure, and it wasn't just from the minister's office, it was from the various downtown offices. The most pressure was probably from the media, and there was a lot of pressure internally to get communications out because we had lost a member. So there was a lot of communications. I was going in front of the media quite a bit.
So you confirmed to Minister Blair when he asked you if the weapons information would be released in that press conference, you confirmed yes, it would be, correct?
Yes.
And that's why that's one of the reasons you were so angry with your deputies in Nova Scotia in that meeting, correct?
I wasn't angry.
You weren't angry at all?
At all. I was disappointed. I felt let down, but I wasn't angry or upset.
And Darren
It's not
Campbell
part
said
of
that
my
you
DNA.
specifically said you promised. You're saying maybe I did, but I definitely said I confirmed to the minister?
I may have said that, but it wasn't the context in what if Darren Campbell put that in his notes, I'm not going to question his notes. What I'm saying, though, is my intention was not, it wasn't a promise in the traditional sense. It was in confirming the answer to a question.
April 23rd, you said that information about the weapons use should not be released because it was involved in it related to an active investigation. Why did you change your mind 4 days later? To me, it seems like this conversation with Minister Blair changed your mind.
No, not at all. It wasn't all about the investigation either. It was the fact
the weapons specifically. You said
Yeah.
not to share it, and then 4 days later, 5 days later, you're reprimanding your deputies for not sharing it.
No, but it wasn't specifically about the weapons, whether to share or not to share. In that email, yes, but it was also about the protocol that they had in place on the ground, because nothing was to be released by anybody in government until the RCMP released in the media.
10 seconds, please, Commissioner.
And
Finish your answer in 10 seconds.
Did the
please.
minister
and secondly,
influence
we had a protocol with the
your
families.
demeanor of that meeting with your deputies? Did the minister influence your demeanor? Why you were so angry? He did not.
No, he didn't.
Okay, we're out of time.
When you had that conversation, or it sounds like you had a number of conversations with Minister Blair about what would be said in that press conference, was that a normal thing that would transpire between you and the minister, especially with a national tragedy such as what happened in Nova Scotia, to relay to him what he could expect to see at the press conference?
Yeah, actually, and many times we provide the speaking notes beforehand, but because there were so many details and it was changing and they were adding and minusing and adding and minusing, we didn't have a final version. And it wasn't necessarily with Minister Blair at that point, it would have been with his staff. Going back and forth, I would provide one. I only gave one copy because, like I said, it was so dynamic, but that's normal practice, yes.
And those conversations, was it only related to the guns that were used, or was it, I mean, I recall Canadians being quite upset about the communications by the Nova Scotia RCMP at the time, and the lack of information that was provided. So was that conversation only about guns, or was it a broader conversation that you had?
No, it was about all the conversations were about several things. The number of deceased was always changing, where the deceased were located, the background of the perpetrator, the replica uniforms and the replica cars were also another. There were so many different points, and what was getting frustrating was that the media was reporting everything before we did. And so when we talk about the number of deceased, for example, I remember looking up on a screen and seeing 22 faces on a screen, and we were reporting different numbers. So we needed to get in front of it. And because this isn't your normal type of investigation in the sense that the perpetrator was deceased, so usually the information is more forthcoming. But my heart goes out. They didn't have the capacity on the ground.
Commissioner, one of the weapons that was banned in the Order of Council was the AR-15. And Minister Blair, when he appeared earlier, talked about Sandy Hook being a shooting in the United States with an AR-15 that in particular impacted him. My colleague, Mr. Hardie, mentioned the Christchurch shooting in New Zealand. Marine Corps combat veteran Dr. Kyle-Ann Hunter testified before the U.S. Congress recently and explained the difference between an AR-15 and other types of weapons. And she said, quote, "It was designed to kill someone wearing a military helmet. What that does to a civilian wearing nothing is liquefy organs." And that really struck me in terms of why in both 2015 and 2019 we promised to ban weapons like the AR-15, and also why it was in the minister's mandate and why we took action in the Order in Council. I'm just wondering, Commissioner, you have far more experience than I do. Is that an accurate description of an AR-15?
I would like to say that I have that kind of experience, but I don't. I have subject matter experts who assist me in the firearms regulations, and specifically we have a lab with a full inventory of weapons. They're far more adept at that than I am.
Well, given she was in the Marines, I'm going to suggest that she probably does have a fair amount of experience to be able to say that. Was the RCMP involved in discussions with the Minister's Office about what weapons to be included in that Order in Council? And how long did those conversations had been going on?
We are always involved with anything with policy or legislation that affects policing, as is the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police. The same type of process was when we were dealing with the cannabis legislation as well. So, of course, within the RCMP, we have many subject matter experts who come to the table and brief the minister regularly when they were looking at legislative policy and policy
And
changes.
how long had that been going on, Commissioner? Because the announcement was made, and it seems to be a suggestion that the decision to do this was done as a result of
For
the
months.
months?
Months and years, probably since I got in the chair.
Yeah,
Mr. Campbell's notes have been mentioned several times, and I will mention them too. Because they raise some major questions, and I'd like to hear from you on that, Ms. Lucki. In a release you published, you stated that you would never take measures or decisions that could compromise an inquiry. Do you consider that publicly divulging the type of weapons used before the inquiry was over in this case is the type of thing that can compromise an inquiry?
I'm a bit confused because the inquiry wasn't, there was no inquiry at the point when we were discussing that in a media release. Is that what you're referring to?
Ce que je veux dire, c'est...
What I mean is, there seems to have been political pressure to reveal the type of weapons used. And what we're hearing from Nova Scotia RCMP is that that might have compromised the inquiry to reveal them publicly. Do you agree with that it could have compromised the inquiry?
That's very difficult to say because there was no inquiry called at the time that we were talking about the release of these, the types of weapons that were seized. It wasn't till months later that those weapons, that was released, and it wasn't released by ourselves.
Et à ce stade-ci, est-ce que vous considérez...
And at this point, at this stage, hypothetically, do you consider that that type of thing could compromise an inquiry?
It's hard to be hypothetical because it depends on what they're looking at in the inquiry. If they're not looking at weapons, then it might not compromise anything.
We just heard from the minister. He said that he never had you promise to divulge what weapons were used. You just said the same thing. You said that you were not pressured by the minister or by the prime minister. But you said that there were pressures exercised by the federal government to obtain certain information. Could you tell us what that pressure was? What were the types of conversations you were having with the government that ultimately made you state that you had pressure on you?
Pressure for every single bit of information related to this incident. Number of deceased, where the deceased were located, who the deceased were, the background of the deceased, the perpetrator, the background of the perpetrator's common law spouse, the fire hall incident, the types of vehicles the perpetrator had, the replica uniforms, it went on, and it was relentless, especially from the media. And myself, the minister and the prime minister were going in front of the media in the first 3 days quite often. And so to have as much up-to-date information as we could was important. So it was about me providing situational awareness, and most of it was done on my volition to them in regards to this is a normal practice of giving situational awareness to events such as, well, there is no event such as this.
And I'll just look at Mr. Campbell's notes to get back in the context. He said about that meeting.
Said she did not raise her voice, but her choice of words was indicative of her overall dissatisfaction with her work. The commissioner accused me of disrespecting her by not following her instructions. Il parle de notamment. She told 𝐏𝐿MS to tell us at H Division to include specific info about the firearm used by the killer. Alors, vous aviez donné des instructions.
So you did give instructions that it seems were not followed, and you were upset, or at least bothered by that. And you made a link with your conversations with the government. That promise, or whatever it was, to give information about the types of weapons used. Do you confirm what is in those notes? You were upset, perhaps by something else, perhaps by other things that were discussed at the meeting?
Sure, we're out of time, but I want to give the commissioner 15 seconds to answer that question. Go ahead, Commissioner.
I want to stress that I was not upset. First of all, upset and anger is not part of my DNA. I'm a fairly calm police officer. I always spoke in terms of how I felt. I felt disappointed, and I felt frustrated with the flow of information over the past 10 days. And using the weapons as an example was one example of the lack of flow of information that was coming back and forth between the ground and national headquarters.
But I guess, you know, for some people, when they see the Minister of Public Safety asking you as Commissioner of the RCMP whether or not the information on the firearms would be released at a press conference, because of the very nature of the relationship that the minister has with the Commissioner of the RCMP, some people might perceive that to be undue influence in the very posing of the question. Do you see how that could be perceived by some members of the public?
Anything's possible, but there was also a lot of questions about the names of the deceased and when those names were going to be released, when the information about the firearm incident was going to be released. There was always, because they could not talk about anything until we spoke about it at the media events. So, of course, anything that we hadn't spoken to date was of interest. And I have to say, I really pride myself on giving accurate and timely information. So to not give that information when I'm briefing the minister or by extension the prime minister is not something I like to do. So I like to be accurate and timely.
Did you, Commissioner, get a sense that when the question was posed to you that this was information that the minister and his chief of staff did really want to see released in the public? Like, you know, in the asking of the question, could you infer that this is a result they actually wanted to see happen at the news conference given by the RCMP?
I didn't think at all. It was a question, I provide an answer. The minister is very, very conscious of first of all, he has an appetite for questions. He's a former police officer, so the who, what, where, why, when, and how is it's part of his DNA. So anytime there's an event, he will ask those questions. I provide the answers I can, but I'm always going back to the source because I often don't know what the answers are to those questions. So I wouldn't infer anything from what he said. It was a simple question that I was going to provide a response to.
If the minister had asked for this information to be released through the RCMP, do you think that would be regarded as an operational directive or more of a communications directive?
I think it could be a little bit of both. The thing is, if information could be released, then I would say, yes, it can be released, and I will ask them to do that. I will check and see if they can actually do that, or if they can't or cannot. The question is not interference. It's what happens with it. And so if I feel that the question is forcing me to do something that I don't want to do, to me that's interference. Or asking me to do something in the investigation is interference. Or asking me to arrest somebody or not arrest somebody, or, you know, sanctions on somebody or not sanctions on somebody. That's interference. Asking questions is not interference.
It says under the direction of the minister, the commissioner has control and management of the force. Some people have complained that is far too vague and very open to interpretation. Do you feel we as legislators could be looking at that to shore it up so that we are not in situations like this in the future?
You're out of time, Mr. MacGregor. I want to give the commissioner 15 seconds to answer that question.
Anything that prevents me from coming back to this committee to answer these questions would be welcome.
Commissioner, would it be fair to say, Commissioner, that it is your belief that this entire saga has been the result of a miscommunication, that you were mistakenly told that the information about the guns would be revealed, and that led to the meeting where you were unhappy about the information not being revealed? Would you say the miscommunication is the heart of the issue?
Yeah, I think miscommunication is the heart of many issues.
Okay, but of this issue in particular, there was a miscommunication. Now, in the meeting you had with Minister Blair, where you gave him the confirmation that the information about the firearms would be included, how many people were in attendance of that meeting?
It wasn't a meeting. It was just a question, I think, from his chief of staff.
Was it an email?
You know, unfortunately, normally my calendar tells me everything I do each and every day. Unfortunately, I was by myself because COVID, everybody was working from home.
But earlier you said that the minister asked if the guns would be included. You said that earlier.
The minister's office.
The minister's office. Who in the minister's office?
It would be the chief of staff.
So the chief of staff, not the minister, asked you if the guns would be included.
At that point in time, I wasn't talking very often to the minister. It was more with his office.
But the deputy minister earlier today said that you had a meeting with the minister during this time period. He was not in attendance at the meeting. Did you have a physical meeting or a teleconference call with the minister between April 23rd and April 28th?
I don't have that in my records. I know that I was speaking, and I was speaking with that office fairly regularly on this event, as there was a couple of other things going on as well outside of this event.
But the minister said you guys were meeting on an almost daily basis in the wake of this.
The first 3 to 5 days, yes.
So you weren't meeting on a daily basis between the 23rd and the 28th? Or even semi-daily?
We didn't physically meet very often because of COVID.
So it was over the phone, so you would have had no way to tell who else could have been in the meeting?
Yeah, absolutely.
Were you aware of like departmental staff or political staff or just?
No, if any time I was talking to the minister, it could have been just him and his chief of staff. I had no way of knowing for sure.
Okay.
We didn't have MS Teams or video.
When you sent the email on April 23rd, when you said that the information about the firearms should not be disseminated beyond the Prime Minister and the Minister of Public Safety, you have every reason to believe that the Minister of Public Safety understood the direction from your email, that the information should not be shared beyond the Minister of Public Safety and the Prime Minister's office.
You would have to ask him if he understood, but
So-
it was pretty clear, I think.
So you can confirm that that information was relegated to the minister. The minister was told. So
And the information was never released.
So how would, like, that should have just ended the conversation right there. Why 5 days later were you being asked by the minister's office if this information would be included? If you had just told them 5 days before that this information should not be included because it will impact an active investigation, what changed? Like, how would it have been appropriate in any way for the minister or the minister's office to ask even the most benign question about, oh, is this information going to be included? What would make them believe that that was appropriate in any way, given your previous direction?
It wasn't just about weapons. Questions were asked, when are the names of the deceased going to be
But you were
released?
asked specifically about whether the guns would be included. You said that in your testimony. You were asked specifically about the guns.
Yes.
Appel au règlement, Monsieur le Président.
Sorry?
Stopping my time. Is there a point of
Who
order?
has a point of order?
C'est Greg Fergus.
Yes, Mr. Fergus, go ahead.
J'aimerais juste, selon
I'd like to just state that according to Section 18, we need to give witnesses the time to answer.
Thank you. So I had
Go
about
ahead,
3
Mr.
minutes.
Lloyd.
I had 3 minutes and 30 seconds on my timer. So
I'd say
Thank you,
save
Mr.
your
Chair.
time, Mr. Lloyd. Don't worry.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You said specifically in your testimony that the minister's office asked if information about the guns would be included. You specifically said that, correct?
Yes.
Okay. What would have made them think that that was an appropriate thing to ask, given that 5 days earlier you said this information should not be disseminated beyond the Prime Minister and the Public Safety Minister's office? Was there a meeting that you had in those previous 5 days where you said, actually, it's not a big deal if the information is released?
No, it's because things changed like
What
hourly.
changed?
Everything was changing hourly. Like those weapons were seized. Things change so that we can release certain points of information. We were continually adding information at each and every press conference that we did. So to ask if they are going to be part and parcel of another media release was not unusual.
But what changed? What changed about the guns in particular between those 5 days? Was there no active investigation anymore in the where the guns came from?
No, I was assuming that eventually that would be part of a media release. And so asking that question was not an unusual request because I was given the information thinking that in a couple of days that would be part of a future media release. And I was simply giving them the heads up.
Was there any discussions
Thank
about
you.
the upcoming...
Thank you. We're out of time.
And what can you say to us about the work that was done previously in respect of banning weapons such as the one that was used in this awful tragedy?
As per the conversation with Ms. Damoff, it was absolutely something that's been on the radar for several years. It followed from Mr. Goodale into Minister Blair's portfolio and the mandate, and it continued with Minister Menachino, and we've been helping them with policy and legislation for several years, well before I became the commissioner.
Can you share with us whether or not you felt the pressure that you were under was inappropriate in any way, shape, or form from the minister or from the government?
Absolutely not. The only inappropriate pressure was the media.
And do you think that, and if you were to look back, were you asked to do anything out of the ordinary that a government should not be asking you to do in such a situation?
Absolutely not.
Did the minister ask you to do anything inappropriate or questionable as time evolved, not just at the beginning, but throughout that would then change the way in which you might answer a question or you might speak to the media?
Absolutely not.
When answering my colleague, Mr. Lloyd, you spoke about how facts on the ground change and how your ability to answer questions based on information that you can provide changes. Can you explain to all of us and to Canadians the context that you were under on day 1 or day 3 or day 5 and how you make the decisions that allow you, how decisions are made that allow you to provide different types of information at different points in time?
Well, it's a communication reel, actually, and any time that from the very first press release that I did or press interview to the very last, I don't have the information in front of me. I go to my comms people, they go to the people on the ground. The comms person on the ground is part of the command triangle in an investigation. They're privy to everything. They, with the people who are investigating, decide what can and can be released and when it can be released. And so when I'm doing media, that's how I get the information. But I'll tell you, I was by myself in the office, unusually, because I usually have a whole team around me that tell me where I need to be, what time I need to be there. They put the meetings in my calendar. I was, like I said, it was so unusual in that context because of COVID.
But despite that unusual nature of COVID and everything that was happening, you were absolutely crystal clear on the lines that could not be crossed. And you can stand here hand to heart and say not a single line was crossed either by you or by the minister in the type of questions that you were asked, the work that you were asked to do, and in the information you were asked to provide?
I can clearly say that I was not interfered with, I was not directed, and I did not cross any line.
Chair, I'd like to come back to what I was talking about earlier, Mr. Campbell's notes.
We didn't understand that this was tied to pending gun control legislation that would make officers in the public safer. She was very upset, and at one point, Deputy Commissioner Brennan tried to get things to calm down, but that had little effect. Et vous avez dit, Madame la Commissaire.
Madam Commissioner, you said that you were not upset, that you are a calm person. I don't want to contradict you. I wasn't there at that meeting. But Mr. Campbell was there, and he is contradicting you in his notes. And so, Mr. Brennan, is it true that you had to calm the tension? It's true that sometimes things can get more tense during a meeting? According to Mr. Campbell's notes, you tried to calm things down. Is that true?
Yes, that would be accurate. At that point in the meeting, I felt that we were revisiting the same thing over and over again, and we needed to start focusing on how to move forward. So my focus was on, let's learn from these mistakes or these issues, and how are we going to do better in communicating in the future. And that's what I was trying to steer the conversation toward.
So you agree that there were numerous communication problems in this situation?
Yes, there was communication issues because of the volume of information, the size of the investigation, the timeliness of information coming into national headquarters, what was being reported on social media versus what was being reported officially. So communications and the complexity of the whole situation was adding to it, and it was something that we needed really to work on to make things clarified for governments, for our employees, and for the general public.
Chair, Commissioner Lucki, can you just confirm for me? So when the government asked if the information about the firearms would be released, that question, in fact, did come from the minister's chief of staff.
This is my recollection. I know it didn't come specifically from the minister. It came from his office.
Okay, so that was the question. And we know that in the course of a police investigation, the make and model of a firearm used in the commission of a crime is a very significant piece of information. What operational information did you have as commissioner that allowed you at that time to make the confirmation that that information would in fact be released?
It wasn't about the actual firearms that were being used, because that still needed to be determined and attached to the forensics. It was about the information about the firearms that were seized in the vehicle of the perpetrator.
In your email of April 23rd to the Chief of Staff Commissioner, you said that this is the information that we know about the firearms to date. It doesn't say those were the ones found in the vehicle or not. It wasn't clear. And then you included, and that was at 4 o'clock, and you included a list of the details. Earlier we heard the minister testify that there was a cabinet meeting that day, or a briefing or cabinet meeting somehow with the Prime Minister that day. So between that meeting and this email, where did the request for this information specifically come from? Was it a call from the Chief of Staff after that cabinet meeting?
I was getting general requests from both because I normally, when major events happen, I brief the Deputy Minister of Public Safety, the National Security Advisor to the Prime Minister, and I include often the Chief of Staff to forward so that the Minister will be briefed up. Sometimes I directly brief the Minister, others. So what happened was people were asking both in any of those groups. So I went back to the Nova Scotia people and said, is there anything we can give about the guns? And I was actually told we can't talk about the guns used, we can talk about the guns seized, and that's where that information came from.
Okay, thank you. In your call with the whatever remote system you were using on April 28th, a conference call facility of some sort, who from RCMP headquarters was also on that call?
Deputy Commissioner Brennan, our Director of Communications, Sharon Tessier, and another person from Communications, Dan Bryan.
Dan Bryan, the media relations head.
Yes.
So in that call, it was referenced earlier, you said that the team in Nova Scotia didn't understand that this was tied to pending gun control legislation. Did you say that in that meeting?
What I recall from is that when we were talking about why was somebody might have mentioned why the weapons were important, and I said it's not a surprise because part of the minister's mandate letter is in fact gun legislation. So that's how I was tying it. That's why that's why I inferred the question was being asked if in fact those weapons were going to be included, along with numerous other times that I was asked when information was going to be released, because often in a press conference the Prime Minister was asked something and he didn't have the information, so they'd come back and say, do we have that information? We're not ready to release that yet. Do you have this, so because they were asked these questions, we were just trying to get them the information that they could release.
Because it was part of an active police investigation, which I believe at the time you were trying to, the team was trying to figure out the actual origin of the firearms that came from, and you're dealing with the United States agencies. Was there any reason why anyone outside that police investigation actually required the details of those firearms for any reason whatsoever in an active police investigation?
No, and it's funny because when I think of all of this investigation, I honestly was thinking about the connection, the guns used, and tying them to the forensics. When I asked if any of the information on the guns I have no idea what's going on with the investigation. So I asked the question, can any of the information on the guns be released? I got an email that you saw on the 23rd with the caveat. I said, okay, great. So, and I literally forwarded the email, or, cut and paste and put it towards the people that were asking.
Yeah, and in that email you said, please don't give it beyond the
because
Prime
that was the
Minister
instructions that I
and the
was
Minister.
given.
But at 10 o'clock at night, 6 hours later, in that email chain, you actually copied 5 other government officials and an RCMP person. So you actually started to disseminate it beyond the two that you had said.
I'd have to see that.
Yeah, it's on the email that was provided to the Mass Casualty Commission. Mr. O'Reilly, Mr. Moreau, Mr. Barrick Stewart, and Vincent Rigby were all copied on that same chain. So in essence, you had released the information about the firearms to a large amount of people beyond the Prime Minister.
Some of those were, like, my chief of staff has all the information that I had. The chief of staff like I said, the 3 primary people and their chiefs of staff usually are included, are the NSIA, the National Security Advisor to the Prime Minister, the Deputy Minister to Public Safety, and the Minister via the Chief of Staff.
In the letter to you from Leah Scanlon, I wanted to read one section here. It said, "It stood out to me that once you were informed there was a miscommunication and Sharon advised that she briefed incorrectly." Who's Sharon?
Director of Communications at National Headquarters.
At National Headquarters. So was it Sharon that told you that the information on the firearms would be disclosed?
Yes.
I see. Who did Sharon ask about that? Do you know?
You'll have to ask her. She's in the next panel.
Okay, very good. Because
I'm going to assume
think
it's communications.
Okay. A critical piece here is when the question was asked, was the question asked if it would be disclosed, or did they ask for it to be disclosed?
To my recollection, like I said at the very beginning, it's if that the weapons information would be included.
All right. Now, there were 2 briefings, one on April 24th and the 28th. Did Superintendent Campbell conduct the briefing using prepared notes?
Which briefing are you referring to?
The 24th or the 28th?
Are you talking about a media?
Yes, correct. Yes.
The 24th, I'm not sure because I'm not involved at that level. So you'd have to probably talk to the communications people. I know the one for the 28th because it was so extensive and they were covering so many parts of that. They were actually going through a chronology with maps and locations. They were working with our comms people and their own comms people in reference to his notes to go through all of that.
Were you privy to the notes that were?
No, I don't get involved at that level.
Would, given that you were led to expect that the firearms information would be included in the briefing to the media on April the 28th, did you subsequently ask to see the notes that Superintendent Campbell was using during that briefing?
I definitely saw the speaking notes, but I saw them early on in the day. And like I said, there was many versions that came after, and I didn't follow it. I just had too many other things to do. I left that for my comms people because they kept changing. There was lots of things that were changing, so I wasn't privy to the final version.
Okay.
So to speak.
But in the version that you did see, was there a reference to the firearms?
I don't believe so, no.
Okay, and that wasn't a flag for you at that time?
No.
Then generally your perception of that, if it wasn't a flag for you, then how important was it to your mind that this information be released in those briefings, and why was it important to you?
It wasn't important whether or not it was released. Where I was concerned is that I asked the question, I was told that it would be released, I transmitted that information to the minister's staff. It was again an example of inaccurate information. So, and there was a lot of issues that we were having with the flow of communication. So that whether or not it was released was not a concern. Somebody asked me if it was going to be part of it. I asked them, they said yes, and it wasn't.
In your judgment, did the details of the weapons provided by, excuse me, Superintendent Campbell on April 24th, during that briefing, did that balance the interests of the public and the media for transparency without compromising the investigation?
If he released it, then yes, because that was his call to do. That's part of his job, is to make sure he balances. If it was him who released it in a media release, then it was then he wouldn't have been compromising the investigation if he had released that.
On April 28, 2020, in my role as a CO of H Division, I was doing detachment visits to those most impacted by the casualty event. Those detachments are in the northeast part of Nova Scotia, where most of the murders occurred. Many of our first responders were heavily impacted by this event, as you can well imagine. They were hurting for the loss of their fellow citizens who lived in the communities they policed. We were also mourning the loss of our own Hardie Stevenson, who was murdered by the gunman during the rampage. We were also very much concerned about Constable Chad Morrison, who was shot and wounded during the gunman's rampage. To say that many of our police officers and community members were traumatized would be an understatement. It was my responsibility as the CO to do personal visits to support our members, assess the needs of the communities in the aftermath, and develop action plans for the support of those affected. I was also pursuing the development of strategies for future resource needs. On April 28th, after finishing my detachment visits, I returned to H Division headquarters in Dartmouth. Soon after I got back to the office, I watched Chief Superintendent Campbell's press conference that he and our communications team had been working on for days. At that time, H Division was being heavily criticized for lack of information being shared about the mass casualty. This press conference was extremely important, not only for the RCMP, but for the public to have a preliminary understanding of what occurred during the 13-hour rampage. Chief Superintendent Campbell did an excellent job presenting the facts and answering questions for the many press that were there. After the press conference, I spoke with Leah Scanlon, the Director of Communications for H Division, and Chief Superintendent Campbell, and congratulated them for an excellent job they had done presenting the facts. There were many details that could not be shared publicly due to the ongoing investigation. Shortly thereafter, Ms. Scanlon came back to my office to advise me that Deputy Commissioner Brennan had called her and said that we were required to be on a conference call in 5 minutes with the Commissioner. Ms. Scanlon was visibly upset and advised that the Deputy Commissioner Brennan was very mad and demanded that I, Chief Superintendent Leather, Chief Superintendent Campbell be on the call. We all assembled in my boardroom and were joined by the Commissioner and Deputy Commissioner Brennan and Sharon Tessier from National Headquarters and Dan Bryan. The Commissioner started the conversation. It was evident she was very angry at my team. The tone of her voice and what she said to all of us made it apparent she was not happy. She felt disrespected and disobeyed. It should be noted that I was confused at the start of the conversation. I had not been privy to any conversations that I now know had occurred the night before and during the day of the 28th. During the conference call at one point, I asked Chief Superintendent Leather what this conversation was about. It was apparent Chief Superintendent Leather was as blindsided as I was at the tone and content of the conversation. Near the end of the call, Chief Superintendent Campbell left the room obviously upset, and Ms. Scanlon was emotionally very upset. After the call, both Chief Superintendent and I had a brief conversation about what had occurred and the negative impact on our employees and the inappropriateness of the content. When I left the office shortly after this conversation, I called Deputy Commissioner Brennan and expressed my disappointment at how my team had been treated and the inappropriateness of the tone and the things that were said on the call. Knowing the impact this conference call had on my staff, I advised Deputy Commissioner Brennan the conference call and the content were a very big misstep by the Commissioner, and I don't think the Commissioner realized the impact her words had on our staff. I say all of this without any personal agenda or with any previous issues with Commissioner Lucki. I consider her a friend, and I can honestly say that this meeting was not at all reflective of her leadership style. So it is with regret that it has come to this, but as the commanding officer of 𝐏𝐻 at the time, it's my duty and responsibility to speak up for our members based on the truth and my perspective of the situation. I wish to affirm that I'm testifying on the best of my personal recollection and doing so in the interest of fairness and living up to the vision and values of the RCMP, which I hold dear. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Over 2 years ago, the family members, friends, communities, first responders, and members of the RCMP endured a massive and devastating attack on their loved ones that deeply shook the people of Nova Scotia and Canadians across the country. 2 years later, the gravity of the unprecedented tragedy still has a stronghold on me and my RCMP colleagues. And to this day, I hold the victims, their families, and those who face the danger in my heart. My husband is from Cape Breton, where we spend several months a year. My children are all students or graduates from St. Francis Xavier University in Nova Scotia. I have seen in my family and friends the grief, devastation, and bewilderment caused by the rampage in this province. The sense of loss is profound. I've been invited here today to discuss allegations of political interference in the 2020 Nova Scotia mass murder investigation. On April 18 and 19th, I was more than 1,000 kilometers away and had the benefit of not being in the eye of the storm. I was the Director General of RCMP National Communication Services in Ottawa. While I worked very closely with the communication teams across the country, they ultimately reported to their commanding officers and worked in partnership with their colleagues on the front line who briefed them on operational issues. We provided advice and guidance. Communications generally does not have the authority to direct or dictate what our subject matter experts share. We were nonpartisan and protected our operational independence while respecting the communications protocol of keeping our partners in public safety and the Privy Council office updated. I also regularly briefed our senior leaders, including the Commissioner. While I have a profound respect for the work of the RCMP, my father was a regular member, as is my son, I know enough about the complexities of policing to know that I am by no means an expert. However, what I do know, after more than 3 decades working for several different departments, is how to communicate and how to manage a crisis. As such, in the aftermath of the April 2020 massacre, my positioning was clear. I was strongly advocating for the timely release of information, knowing some would need to be withheld to preserve operational integrity. My goal was to uphold public confidence and trust in our organization, and more specifically, the Nova Scotia RCMP. The backbone of this was to be open and transparent, sharing what we could, and explaining why some details could not be discussed at that time. My goal was to give clarity to the public without divulging any information that could impede an ongoing investigation. It was, to say the least, a delicate balance indeed. This is why I was pushing to share more information constantly, quickly, and openly to the media and to the public. One such item was the weapons used. The public knew about the presence of guns, and I advised that we provide as much detail as possible. In crisis communications, silence is not golden and can breed doubt, rumors, and speculation. You cannot build trust in a vacuum. I was present at the meeting convened at the request of the Commissioner to discuss the ongoing communications on April 28th. Now, 2 years later, and having retired in November, I'm at a disadvantage as I do not have access to all the information from that time, such as emails or communication material, but will share my recollection. I remember it was an unpleasant meeting. Commissioner Lucki was controlled, but clearly frustrated and dissatisfied with our overall communication efforts. I cannot speak to how others felt, but it was emotional for me. I don't know anyone that likes to hear that their boss is unhappy with their work, particularly after so much effort. At the meeting, I shared that I had informed the Commissioner that there would be more clarity on the weapons, albeit at a high level, during the news conference held earlier that morning. I briefed her that it would go one way, then it went another. And to my recollection, this was the impetus for the conference call shortly after. With regard to political pressure, I cannot recall the Commissioner's exact comments, but I do remember she was irritated that she had briefed the Minister that we would be proactively discussing the weapons based on my earlier update. I'm not here to second guess my actions or those of my colleagues. Our experiences, perspectives, and views were different. They were under immense pressure in Nova Scotia. There had clearly been some miscommunication between us, as can happen when moving at an unrelenting pace, adjusting to remote work, and having numerous versions and discussions circulating at once. I offer this for context, not as an excuse. These are the perspectives from which I will be speaking today, and I look forward to answering your questions to the best of my knowledge.
On the SECU Committee, my name is Chief Superintendent Chris Leather. I am the Criminal Operations Officer for the RCMP's H Division, Nova Scotia, as I was so assigned in April 2020. I've been a police officer for over 32 years and a commissioned officer since 2014. I'm honored to be here in person today along with my colleagues Ms. Bergerman and Ms. Tessier. Before I offer my introductory remarks, I would like to take a minute to recognize the Portapique tragedy of April 18th and 19th, 2020, one that so horrendously impacted the country, province, its communities, and of course the victims and their families in Nova Scotia. The impacts have been and continue to be felt by the public, our membership, and the pain will be felt by all for many years to come. As Canada's worst ever mass murder, we are forever scarred by the senseless act of violence perpetrated by the lone gunman. In all of this, I am proud of our members' dedication, commitment, and resilience, then and now, in the face of such horrendous events and criticism. I'm returning to Nova Scotia tomorrow, and I'm scheduled to testify for 2 days at the Mass Casualty Commission. Also, I recently provided a 10-hour audio recorded statement to MCC Council pertaining to my roles and responsibilities during and after the Portapique tragedy, and I will remain engaged to assist with policy change, law amendments, and cultural change, and whatever else is asked of me. We look forward to receiving the final report from the Mass Casualty Commission in November this year and acting on the report's recommendations. We know there are many areas we can improve on and gaps that we will address. I know the after-action report work will be crucial to bolstering public safety and confidence in the RCMP. I want the committee to know that we recognized issues early on, and where we could, we have already begun to address the gaps identified working shoulder to shoulder with our provincial government counterparts, the Nova Scotia Municipal Police Chiefs, fellow criminal operations officers, and commanding officers across Canada, and of course the communities we serve, to improve and evolve as an organization. The RCMP is a provincial police service in Nova Scotia, and we serve at the behest of the province of Nova Scotia, the public, and Public Safety Canada. We take this responsibility seriously, and we look forward to serving Nova Scotians in this capacity for years to come. My role as a criminal operations officer is as the de facto 2IC of the RCMP in Nova Scotia, with all operational units and programs except federal policing roll up under me. This includes all general duty policing and specialized policing services for the RCMP, including, but not limited to, uniform policing, specialized policing services, including our emergency response team and critical incident commanders, and operational communications managers and call takers, all who played critical roles in our Portapique response. I understand the focus of this committee's work is to determine whether there was political interference with the RCMP as it related to the gun legislation passed by the federal government in May of 2020. I was a participant in the April 28th teleconference hosted by Commissioner Lucki, which included Deputy Commissioner Brennan, Ms. Tessier, Mr. Dan Bryan, Assistant Commissioner Bergerman, Chief Superintendent Campbell, Ms. Leah Scanlon, and myself. As I did in my MCC statement, I'm available to answer questions concerning what I heard on the call and my related roles and responsibilities leading up to the call of April 28th. A key after discussion with my colleagues, namely the CO, Lee Bergerman, Chief Superintendent Campbell, and Director of Corporate Communications, Leah Scanlon. What I will say at this point is that the meeting was remarkable in its timing. Only 10 days after the tragedy, the call contents infused with emotion and a reference to pending gun control legislation by the Commissioner just a few minutes after a key press conference given by Chief Superintendent Campbell, during which he effectively provided a comprehensive update on the criminal investigation known as 𝐏𝐻, including associated timelines. What I will also say is that I was unaware of the key lead-up conversations that had occurred between Chief Superintendent Campbell, Ms. Scanlon, Ms. Tessier, and Dan Bryan of National Corporate Communications on the evening of April 27th and into the morning of April 28th, surrounding the firearms used by the gunman, specific to the talking points that were prepared for Chief Superintendent Campbell's April 28th televised news conference. I was truly taken aback by the discussion at the teleconference, and it would take several post-fact discussions for me to piece together and to better understand the context of the comments.
Your time's up, sir. Just 10 seconds, please.
I've completed this post-fact review and have a much clearer sense now of what occurred. I look forward to sharing with you what I heard and have learned since. Thank you very much.
Tessier. Ms. Tessier, you were the former Director General of the National Communications Service for the RCMP, correct?
Yes, I was.
Following the Nova Scotia attacks, you would have been in direct communication with Minister Blair's office, notably his staff, and the Prime Minister's office, notably the Prime Minister's staff, correct?
No, I was not. I have a director of corporate communication or of operational communications, and she was the one that was briefing, as we call it, downtown, which was public safety and Privy Council office. We have a protocol that the minister's office reaches out through Public Safety Canada, not directly to us.
What was her name?
Jolene Bradley.
And who is her contact in the Prime Minister's office?
Oh, she would not have been dealing with the Prime Minister's office. It would have been Privy Council office, so it would have been probably Ken McKillop, who was the head of the communications at PCO.
Was there anybody in Minister Blair's office she was dealing with?
Not that I'm aware of. She would have been dealing with our colleagues in communications at Public Safety.
Here, Ms. Bergerman, you mentioned a meeting that happened the evening before the April 28th press conference and a subsequent meeting with Commissioner Lucki. Did I hear you correct? There was a meeting the night before?
I'm not aware of a meeting.
I misheard you. I'm going to ask you a few questions just in response to Leah Scanlon and Darren Campbell's notes and letter. Leah Scanlon also mentioned to the MCC in an interview that the Prime Minister and Minister Blair were, quote, were weighing in on what we could and couldn't say. Was that your experience?
Only on this particular phone call that we had on the 28th, that there was a reference to the minister putting pressure on the commissioner.
So according to your, and you think you're referencing what Leah Scanlon had also referenced, that the commissioner indicated Minister Blair pressured her to release this information. Was that what you heard from Commissioner Lucki as well?
I heard minister. I don't recall hearing Minister Blair.
And what did Commissioner Lucki say about the minister, that some minister had pressured her to release the information about the weapons used in the attack?
The conversation was more about we didn't understand the big picture, and that there was pressure from the minister to release the caliber and the make and models of the weapons used in the mass casualty.
So you would agree with Darren Campbell's notes that Commissioner Lucki, the words he used was promised Minister Blair and the Prime Minister's office that that information would be released?
Yes.
So you heard the commissioner say she promised the minister and the Prime Minister's office?
Yes.
And did the Commissioner Lucki directly tie that to the forthcoming firearm policy from the Liberal government?
Yes.
She did. So she said the pressure was from the minister and the Prime Minister's office, that she had promised them that that information would be released, and the pressure was a result of it being tied to the forthcoming gun policy from the Liberal government. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Mr. Leather, can you answer that as well, the same questions?
Yes, and I've had an opportunity to review the notes that Superintendent Campbell, or Chief Superintendent Campbell, now also prepared. And I have to say, with great detail, he provided a comprehensive and detailed overview, which essentially to the letter I would support. So certainly on the points that Ms. Bergerman spoke about, I would agree with the statements made concerning the Minister, the Prime Minister's office, and the impending gun legislation.
This statement in particular that we just went over, but just to confirm, Darren Campbell said that Commissioner Lucki said to you in the group that she had promised Minister Blair and the Prime Minister's office that the information about the weapons used in the attack would be released. That's what you're referring to?
That's what I recall hearing.
And that it was that pressure, which was also said, correct?
There was pressure. Yes, she was under pressure.
And then that was related to the upcoming firearm policy from the Liberal government.
Yes, it is.
Were either of you aware that the announcement for that upcoming firearm policy would be May 1st?
I wasn't.
So was this the first time you were hearing of this forthcoming firearm policy?
From the Commissioner, yes.
And then, again, just to go back to Ms. Scanlon, what she had said that the Minister Blair and the Prime Minister were weighing in on what could and couldn't be said. Does that seem to, based on what you heard from Commissioner Lucki, that seems to be accurate? They were the Prime Minister and the Prime Minister's office and Bill Blair were, in essence, trying to pressure Commissioner Lucki on what would be released?
Based on what I heard on this particular teleconference.
Thank you. Ms. Tessier, you were in the room as well, correct?
Yes, I was.
Do you have the same recollection as Ms. Bergen, Mr. Leather, Mr. Campbell, and Ms. Scallon?
I do not. I remember her being irritated that she had told the minister that we would be releasing guns, but I do not remember talk of pressure or any of the like. I didn't take notes, which is not helpful.
It's interesting, Ms. Tessier, you work with the national headquarters RCMP, not the Nova Scotia
Yes.
RCMP, correct? And
Yes.
Mr. Leather, you work with the RCMP in Nova Scotia, correct?
Yes, I do.
And Ms. Bergen does as well, as does Darren Campbell and Leah Scanlon at the time. So the four individuals from the RCMP in Nova Scotia have a different recollection than Ms. Tessier and Commissioner Lucki. I find that very interesting. With my remaining seconds, did you have anything to add?
And we're
Ms.
out of
Bergen?
time, Ms. Dancho.
Thank you.
I'd like to come back to some of your answers that you made to my colleague a little earlier. I agree with her that it's a bit curious that the people who remember the meeting of 28th of April from the Nova Scotia RCMP seem to remember things quite differently from the national RCMP. And I'd like to come back to that. Ms. Bergerman, please first. Could you please just come back a little bit to how that meeting happened, what it was like? You said that the RCMP commissioners seemed to be experiencing pressures from the government, from the Minister of Public Safety, from the Prime Minister, and from their respective teams. They seem to want some information about the weapons used to be divulged, the caliber, the model of those weapons. So what made you think that the commissioner was under pressure from the government? Could you please go into that in detail? And tell me about your thinking at the time, your reaction. Does it reflect what we saw in Mr. Campbell's notes?
Thank you for the question. So I think it's important to remember that going into this conference call, I was taken back by the tone and the content of it because I wasn't aware of any of these conversations going on about what was required or what was wanted in the press conference. So I was confused, and when it started off, it was evident that the commissioner was angry. No yelling, just you could tell. I know her well enough to know when she's angry, and that she used phrases like "I promised the minister." She didn't say what minister. I understood minister. And that the caliber and the types of weapons that were used in the mass casualty would be disclosed in the press conference. And that was her expectation.
Okay, and so what I understood from Mr. Campbell's notes is that he answered that he could not share that information at that time because it might compromise the inquiry. Do you agree with that?
Not the inquiry, the investigation.
L'enquête, ouais. Peut-être la traduction tout à l'heure.
It might have been an interpretation issue. Mr. Leather, essentially the same questions for you. Can you tell me more about what happened during the meeting and your impression of whether the commissioner was experiencing political pressures? We know that just asking for information doesn't amount to interference, but when there's a certain level of pressure to get information more quickly, that may be what happened here. Is that your impression?
For the member through the chair, I think it's important to provide some context too in the lead up to the call of the 28th. It was around April 22nd that I got a phone call from the commissioner directly requesting the gun inventory, for lack of a better term, the list of guns, makes, models, and serial numbers. So really, that's when it began for me in terms of this issue. And it was a request that obviously I took seriously directly from the commissioner. That would be out of the norm of communication to a criminal operations officer, but again, under the circumstances, the gravity of the situation, it didn't seem completely odd to me, because that would be something that would make sense for the commissioner to share within her senior executive committee in Ottawa. That's the deputy commissioners and equivalents. And it was on April 23rd that CO Bergerman and I actually had a conversation with 𝐻𝐻𝐿. 𝐻𝐻𝐿 is the serious investigative team that oversees police activity akin to SIU here in Ontario for matters where there is a death in police custody or at the hands of police. And it was clear from our conversation with the 𝐻𝐻𝐿 director that we would be allowed to provide that gun inventory to the commissioner so long as it was used within the RCMP, and that's it. And that was the agreement and the commitment that we made to the director of 𝐻𝐻𝐿, which I passed along to Ms. Bergerman, which presumably went up to Ottawa. And so that's the background on the lead up. And then really for several days until the 28th, akin to what Ms. Bergerman said, no further discussion on the gun inventory or their speaking notes or any sense of interest from my perspective in the guns being released publicly, internal to government or otherwise. And I would echo Ms. Bergerman's comments about the surprise that it came up the way it did on the 28th for an issue that I thought had essentially been resolved through obtaining this inventory and passing it along to be used for internal discussion and understanding.
Thank you very much.
Ms. Tessier, if I can, maybe I'll start with you. So we now have a fairly well-established timeline of what happened between the commissioner and the minister. She has confirmed, in fact, that it was the minister's chief of staff who had asked her if the makes and models of the firearms, the detailed information about the firearms, could be released. And she made the confirmation / promise saying that, yes, it could. So just to confirm, when she did confirm that with the minister's chief of staff, was she basing that on the information that you had provided her? Could you just confirm the process that led her to be able to make that confirmation to the chief of staff?
I'm not aware of when she briefed the chief of staff. I just know that I briefed her, and I had briefed her, I believe it was the evening of the 27th or first thing on the 28th, that we would be releasing more information on the guns. I did send a revised set of speaking notes to the commissioner, and the version I sent one of the versions I sent did include information on the firearms to the best of my recollection. I cannot remember how much detail was in there, but there was reference to the firearms. And I have never been in a briefing between the commissioner and the minister or the minister's office. So I can't speak to that.
But we can assume that based on that information that you've just confirmed that you gave her, that she was able to make a confirmation on that. So now maybe I'll turn to Ms. Bergerman. When, in ongoing police investigations, when it comes to the make and model of a firearm that's used in any kind of a crime, and given the state that the Nova Scotia inquiry investigation was at that particular moment, Superintendent Campbell had made reference to the fact that during the teleconference, he said, and I quote, "I tried to explain there was no intent to disrespect anyone. However, we could not release this information at this time," end quote. Can you just educate the committee and the public and the media here as to why he would tell the commissioner that? Why at that time was that information so sensitive that it could not yet be released?
So at that time, there was an ongoing investigation as it relates to the weapons, because we were working with the FBI and with our counterparts in the U.S. and the U.S. Border Patrol and CBSA. So it was kind of an investigation still going on between those 3 or 4 different agencies, and there was some determinations of how the gunmen got the guns, got the weapons that had not been flushed out completely, and there were still many witnesses that had to be interviewed. So it would be detrimental to that investigation to have that out in the public for potential witnesses to hear all this information without first getting the information from that witness.
So as Superintendent Campbell's notes indicate, and which you have confirmed are quite accurate in retelling how that conference went. So the commissioner came onto the teleconference after she had made a confirmation / promise. There's some ambiguity over to which particular word, but in any case, she, as she tells it, had made a confirmation to the minister's office that this information would be released. It was patiently explained to her by Superintendent Campbell that this could not be released at this time because of the investigation. But then she then came back after that information was relayed to her and said that you, the group, didn't understand that this was tied to pending gun control legislation. The notes are not very clear after that. Can you, by recollection, tell us what was the reaction in the room when she stated that, even after Superintendent Campbell told her that, sorry, we can't at this time because of the ongoing investigation?
Well, the reaction was, I would say, confused and a bit stunned, actually, because any police officer knows that if you're in the middle of an investigation, certain information cannot be released. And in this case, Superintendent Campbell, who is in charge of support services, or was at the time, and the major crime team working on this investigation work under him, and they're the ones that ultimately make the decision because they have the intimate details of the investigation. And they said, at this time, the weapons and caliber and all of those details cannot be released to the public.
Chief Superintendent Leather, do you have anything else to add to that? I mean, Ms. Bergerman said there was a sense of confusion in the room. Do you have anything to add to that in the final 30 seconds?
I would just reiterate the importance of the sanctity of that information 10 days after the tragedy. And Darren Campbell was well positioned to make that statement to the Commissioner and to provide that rebuff to her, given his knowledge of the file, his courage of convictions around that. And there was an exchange, if you will, between them about the importance of that. And I don't believe that the Commissioner was overly compelled or convinced with his response, saying that we didn't fully understand the implications of not releasing.
You are both very seasoned police officers and investigators. Did either of you take notes of the conversation?
Yes.
Could you table those with the committee?
Not here, I can't. I would have to get them out of Nova Scotia to be able to table them.
Superintendent, could you do that as well?
Yes, I have them here.
Oh, that would be great. Thank you very much. I know at RCMP HQ, they have the ability to tape every phone conversation. Did your office have in the conference room have ability to tape this conversation, or did you?
We did not tape the conversation.
Okay. Thank you. Chief Superintendent Leather, you said that CERT said that the information on the firearms could not be released to anyone outside of the RCMP, and that was on April 23rd. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
So at 4 o'clock on April 23rd, when the Commissioner emailed the details of the firearms to people outside of the RCMP, was she breaking rules with CERT?
I'm not sure that the Commissioner was aware of that caveat that was put on the notes. My communication with the gun inventory went to Ms. Bergerman, and where it got communicated beyond that and what was contained in a caveat or not, I'm not sure. But it was clear from our conversation with Mr. Curran, the director, that that was the expectation of the RCMP, that we keep it in-house, and I certainly pass that along.
And that would not be an unusual request in the circumstances?
Under the circumstances, because they pertain to the gun inventory of the weapons seized from the gunman's car at the now infamous Big Stop where he was dispatched, and that CERT, in fact, had primacy on that investigation because there was an investigation into the shooting of the gunman by our members. Yes, H. Strong was an ongoing criminal investigation that we were running parallel, And therefore, it's only appropriate that we would consult with the CERT director to make sure he was comfortable with its release.
And so the commissioner would have known that in the incident where RCMP had been involved in a shooting, generally CERT would insert itself into those situations and would restrict the information flow.
The commissioner would be well aware of the CERT investigation, yes.
Okay. Ms. Tessier, were you involved in the drafting of the commissioner's public statement for June 21st that was released this year?
No, June 21st this year, I've been retired since November.
Okay. Were you informed that evening in the 40 minutes when the shooting started that this had happened?
No.
When were you informed?
I believe it was the following morning. It is terrible to say, it is a blur. I believe it was the following morning.
Okay, thank you. I have more questions, but I'd like to turn the rest of my time over to my colleague, Raquel Dancho.
Mr. Chair, I'm going to move a motion which procedure-wise we know we would need to discuss now, or at your discretion, Mr. Chair, of course, on the will of the committee, we could discuss it after we finish this round of questions from all parties. My staff has hard copies in both languages and is emailing an electronic copy to the clerk now. Mr. Chair, I move the following motion, that pursuant to the standing order the committee, Standing Order 1082, the committee hold a meeting on the allegations of political interference in the 2020 Nova Scotia mass murder investigation study no later than August 31st, 2020, to hear from the following witnesses: Superintendent Darren Campbell, Nova Scotia RCMP; Leah Scanlon, former RCMP Communications Director; Alison Whelan, RCMP Chief Strategic Policy and Internal Relations Officer; Dan Bryan, Director of Media Relations, RCMP; Jolene Bradley, Director of Strategic Communications Operations; Ken McKillop, Assistant Secretary to the Cabinet, Communications and Consultations, Privy Council Office; and the Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada and his officials.
RCMP, I don't know who it was sharing drafts with you, Ms. Tessier. Is that correct?
Yeah, we were working on them together, yes.
Okay, and then you were sharing information with Commissioner Lucki?
Yes, with her office, with Rob O'Reilly.
Okay, and then the information that was shared by you with Commissioner Lucki was in turn shared with Minister Blair or his staff?
Well,
that's what she told us. That's
yeah,
what
okay,
the commissioner told us.
Yeah.
So I guess
what she told us.
I guess what I'm trying to clarify is that the commissioner had shared information that she thought was going to be shared publicly. And if I remember at the time, there was a lot of frustration by all parties, by the public, by people in Nova Scotia about what information was coming out. So there were challenges with communications between the people on the ground in Nova Scotia and with the commissioner in terms of what was going to be said at that press conference, correct?
Yes.
So, Ms. Bergerman, would it not make sense that the commissioner was then upset when she spoke to you about the fact she'd been given, and I'm not trying to lay blame with anyone because I think it was a really important point the commissioner brought up, that at the time this happened, we were a month into COVID, and there was a challenge with people having been sent home. The normal working conditions were not in place. So, I mean, I would think that the commissioner would have been upset about her not being in the loop about what being shared at the press conference.
Yeah, well, that makes sense now, why she was upset, but it should have never been shared with her that we were going to release details of weapons and calibers or whatever the ask was. She should never have been told that.
I don't disagree with you, and that was but that was what happened, and I think it's important to point out the information was never shared publicly by anyone from the government or anyone else. In fact, the only way that information did become public, if I remember correctly, was through an ATIP request from the media. So it's not like this information was leaked in any way. It did remain confidential. So I only have, I think, 15 seconds left, Chair. So I just think it's important to remember the challenges COVID presented, and I would suspect that had Nova Scotia's borders not been shut down, that there would have been resources provided to you in Nova Scotia that were not available to you. Is that a fair assessment?
Well, actually, no, because if you were coming into Nova Scotia, even though we had the bubble, and you were coming there to work, it was essential service, basically.
Okay.
Then you didn't have to do any of the
Thank you.
quarantining.
Thank you very much.
In emails that were revealed recently, we saw that the RCMP commissioner said to the public safety minister's team that information about the weapons used by the perpetrator, that information should not go further than the PM's office and the minister's office. From what I understand about the meeting a few days later on April 28th, is that position had completely changed, and that by then the commissioner seemed upset about the fact that information was not going to be made public. In your opinion, and I'll start with you, Ms. Bergerman, what made her change her perspective like that? Were there perhaps conversations with you or with minister's staff which led her to drastically change her position?
I'm unaware of why her position changed. I certainly didn't have any conversations with her about it, and I would always rely first on the wishes of CERT and the wishes of the investigative team at that time, because they have the intimate knowledge of what they can and cannot release. So I don't know what changed her position.
Monsieur Leather, est-ce que vous avez une idée?
Mr. Leather, what about you? Do you have a sense of what could have made that position change drastically within a few days? I understand that in an investigation like this one, there is information that cannot be divulged at an earlier stage, but then later it can be divulged because everything's changing very quickly. So this seems like a fairly major change. What do you think is behind it?
Like Ms. Bergerman, I'm not aware of any conversations. I certainly didn't have any with the Commissioner, Deputy Commissioner, or obviously with Public Safety Canada. And nor was I aware of any significant change from the 23rd to 28th, certainly in terms of the investigation that would have a shift like that in terms of openness and now an ability or desire to want to share that information with the public, because we're talking about the press conference and it going out in the speaking points. So it remains a mystery to me as well.
Interesting information that we've learned here. I'll start with you, Chief Superintendent Leather. Question: you're the CROPS officer, the criminal investigation head, for lack of a better description for us civilians in Nova Scotia. Would you have released this information on the 28th with respect to the guns and caliber, et cetera?
No, sir, we weren't ready to make that release, given the ongoing investigations, particularly stateside, that were in their infancy.
And Ms. Bergerman, you were actually the head of the RCMP for us civilians in Nova Scotia at that time. Would you have released that information?
No, I would not have.
And we've heard from testimony, I think at least written hearsay, that Darren Campbell would not have released that. We know that the CERT would not have released it. So I guess the question is how did that information get to people that shouldn't have had it? How did it get to politicians? How did it get in their hands? Do either of you have any idea how it got there?
I can only make assumptions, sir. And that would be we shared the information with the commissioner and the inventory list that Chief Superintendent Leather was talking about, and that information was passed on to public safety.
And Chief Superintendent Leather, would that be your assumption as well, sir?
Yes, I'm aware of the emails that went from the Commissioner over to the Chief of Staff for Public Safety and the Deputy Minister. But that's the extent of my knowledge with the gun inventory.
So is it fair to say then that you actively would have said, please do not release this information to the politicians, and they got it anyway? Is that fair, Ms. Bergerman?
Yes.
And Chief Superintendent Leather, that's your recollection as well?
My recollection was sharing the caveat that it remain within the RCMP and go no further.
Gotcha. And a question to Ms. Tessier then. You were communicating with the Commissioner of the RCMP. I guess the question is, was it you then who released this information and said, did you have a conversation with the Commissioner and said, do with it what you will?
I didn't have the information.
So you who were the communications director, I think, now just correct me if I'm wrong, you said that you would communicate directly with the commissioner around these around this style of information. Is that correct?
I would communicate with the commissioner around what was going to be released publicly. I did not have access to any operational, I don't have operational information. We discuss what we can discuss publicly. I am not briefed, generally speaking, on makes, models, that type of thing.
So then we have on one side the operations people, the criminal investigators who are saying, do not release this information. And then we have a commissioner who took the information and did with it what she wanted to. That's what it seems to me. Under pressure, of course, yes, under pressure from the politicians. Minister Blair, perhaps. That being said, I think Chief Superintendent Leather, you talked about a meeting on April 27th, perhaps going into the 28th, and you mentioned Dan Bryan, who's another communications person. Was it you, sir, that mentioned that meeting?
I mentioned in my opening remarks that there was communication between Dan Bryan and Leah Scanlon and Darren Campbell in the division. However, I did not participate in those meetings. I just became aware that they were occurring in the lead up to the press conference in terms of the preparation of the speaking points. Dan Bryan having been a member of Sharon's staff at the time.
Right. Thank you, sir. Mr. Chair, I'd like to cede the rest of my time to Mr. Perkins, please.
With regard to the CERT demand that it stay within the RCMP, did you inform the commissioner or her office that that was not to go out beyond the RCMP?
The Deputy Commissioner, Brennan, and it was discussed as well on between Chief Superintendent and Leather and I.
Okay, thank you. Did Ms. Tessier, did at any time you communicate the details to Leah Scanlon of what was being asked before that press conference?
Sorry, time's up. I'll give the witness 10 seconds to answer.
I was never asked to do anything in the conference. I was asking that we release as much information as possible. It wasn't coming from outside.
Continuously. And I submit to you, Ms. Bergerman, that if the superintendent or if the commissioner was not happy in that April 28th conference call that she had with you, it may not have been because the information on the firearms wasn't released, but that what happened was yet another failure in the communication process, one of many that, of course, was putting your department under a lot of stress and pressure and putting the commissioner under a lot of stress and pressure. Is that not feasible here?
Well, that's not what was communicated from her during the phone call. It was directly related to pressure about the caliber of weapons, and that we didn't understand the big picture of the dynamic here with downtown, and certainly didn't say on the call that she was displeased about our overall communication. I would submit that the press conference that Chief Superintendent Campbell had just done was one of the best ones that I've seen.
But if I could, there was an expectation with all of the various speaking notes back and forth, and Ms. Tessier, I want you to chime in on this, that at one point there was a reasonable expectation on the part of the commissioner that the information on the firearms would be disclosed. Now, how that changed and morphed with the various versions of the speaking notes going back and forth perhaps is a discussion that deserves longer time than we have. Tell us what was going on in the ground, because again, in the fog of war, or in this case, this investigation, you had media after you continuously, and you were under a lot of pressure and indeed a lot of criticism for either the nature or scope or accuracy of the information that the RCMP was providing to the public during the episode, as well as after the episode. What was the common knowledge? What kind of information, particularly about the firearms, was being talked about at street level or on the open line shows or in the opinion pieces and news reports? Do you have any information on that?
No, I don't. I can't speak specifically what was being talked about publicly because there was a lot of things being talked about publicly. But I do know that there was, based on Darren Campbell and the investigative team's advice, that it would be detrimental to the investigation to release the weapons and the make and model and caliber publicly.
The witnesses that we have here have said that they would not release the types of weapons to elected officials. However, it was given to them because it was in speaking notes. Is that not correct?
No, that's not correct.
So where did the commissioner understood that the weapons would be released? Why was that?
Well, she understood that we would discuss the weapons. The calibers, the models and all that, I cannot recollect if that was in one of the versions. I remember it was quite high level, but I assume that the decision was made not to discuss them at all because it would just lead to further questions that we couldn't answer at that time. But I did not, from what I understand, the information that was released after a direct request by the commissioner to Nova Scotia.
Okay, thank you.